to all of those that are in person here, as well as to those that will be joining on Zoom. We're glad that you're here for the part 2 of Genesis and immigration, which actually now is moving into Exodus, with building on the foundation of Genesis, with Professor Berquist, who's a Presbyterian minister and working at Ridgecrest, and also a professor at Redlands University and San Francisco Theological Seminary. So welcome, John. Good to have you here. And we're also going to have Raphael greet other people. And then, John, we'll let you begin right with your part 2 on your series.
Hi, Raphael. Buenas tardes, profesor. Bienvenido a la iglesia y a todo el público que nos está viendo hoy día. Espero disfruten la charla de hoy día, que va a ser dedicada al libro del Éxodo. Bienvenido y bienvenidos a todos. Kat is in a playful mood, and if she jumps from where she is onto the keyboard, I have no ability to control what happens. But I will get back. So, yeah, we're not done with Genesis yet, and won't be, but it is kind of the foundation for everything. And we have to deal with a number of other scriptures to see where the stories we heard about last week in Genesis lead us. A number of the stories we looked at before, stories throughout the book of Genesis that talk about immigrants. And really, we would need to say that almost every story, almost every character in the book of Genesis is an immigrant. We focused on Abram. God found Abram over in Babylonia and said, I need you to follow me. Don't worry, it will turn out well for you. But we're just going to head west. And I'm not going to tell you where we're going. And so Abram headed west, didn't have a destination in mind, and ended up about 2,000 miles away from home, really in a different continent. And at that point, God said, do you think this is a good place to settle down? And Abram said, yeah, it looks like way to me. And he started your Apple Music? Yes. I thought so. My cat has started a conversation on the computer with Siri, who does not speak cat, and is very confused, so all better now. One of the, so really the story of God's people starts with immigration. And basically, I would say that every one of God's friends in the Bible is an immigrant. So we saw a number of cases in Genesis, but the last one we really looked at was the story of Joseph. Joseph is the great-grandson of Abraham. And whereas Abraham heard a call from God with a promise that I will take you to a much better place. And Abram set off by his own choosing and by the call of God on this international immigration. Joseph gets into immigration very differently. His brothers are mad at him. I was kind of identified with him because I was the third and last child in my family. My two brothers were more than a decade older than I was. They were big. I got beat up a lot. Parents never believed my stories. And so Joseph, as the younger brother, always made a lot of sense to me. His brothers were not as subtle as mine. They caught him and tossed him down a well. But first they stole his clothes. They went out and killed a goat and smeared the goat's blood all over Joseph's clothes and took it back to their father to say he was attacked by a wild animal and killed, when really the brothers had left him there to die. Now, two of the brothers had a change of mind that night. I'm not quite sure I'd call it a change of heart, because they decided that Joseph shouldn't just die a pointless death down that well. Not when the two brothers could rescue him, sell him into slavery, and make a handy profit. A new plan, whether it's a better plan or not, whether the two brothers who sold him into slavery were the better brothers compared to the ones who wanted him to die, boy, that's difficult to say. We're kind of meant not to like any of those older brothers, whether they're plotting death or plotting profit on slavery. Joseph is picked up by a traveling caravan of slave runners, human traffickers, and is taken into the big empire of Egypt and sold to some taskmasters there for manual labor as a child. As the story goes, Joseph gets some better duties, but he gets framed and arrested and thrown in jail. My guess from the story is he's in his late teens when he is sentenced to life in prison, where life is worse than slavery. So once again, he has been moved against his will, against his best interests, with no promise from God or any human that life will ever get better. But it turns out that Joseph has been having dreams, and he tells people in prison with him about his dreams, and he helps others interpret their own dreams. And he's found so helpful to his fellow prisoners that he kind of becomes famous. And so when Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is having bad dreams and all of his wise counselors and medical doctors and magicians are searching for a way to make the dreams stop, eventually one of them says, I used to be in jail and I know a guy. He's really good at talking people through dreams. And so they find Joseph rotting in prison and bring him to the Pharaoh. And what Joseph tells the Pharaoh helps. And Pharaoh's grateful. He grows to trust Joseph. He releases Joseph from prison, employs him in the palace, gives him more and more responsibility. And Joseph carries a message. We're in years of economic plenty now, but they won't last forever. In fact, there's a 7-year famine coming up. So we need to stockpile food and grain now in order to survive the famine that comes up ahead. And Pharaoh puts him in charge of this, makes him the second most powerful leader in Egypt. And Joseph's very effective. I would like to think that someone who has been through domestic abuse, been through human trafficking, been incarcerated, has the ability to bring all those experiences into being a better boss. He's certainly experienced a whole lot of abusive bosses, and maybe the lesson he's learned is, I will never be like that. And so he becomes a popular and effective boss. I would like to think that. So many cases, it's the opposite that happens, but Joseph makes it work. And every time we see him interacting with others in the palace, they all like him, trust him, and appreciate him. Well, as the story goes, the famine hits. And Egypt is the only country that's prepared for it because Egypt has listened to Joseph's dreams, which came from God. And Egypt's prepared. They have food and nobody else can grow anything. Nobody else for several countries around, and that means Joseph's brother and his aging father. So on the brink of starvation, Joseph's father sends the brothers to go to Egypt, the only place where there's food, and ask for food, beg for food if needed. So the brothers set out on a trip as kind of a third kind of immigrant. They're not going because of the promise of God. They're not going because they were captured and taken away. They're going because it seems like Egypt is their only hope and the only way to keep feeding their family. And so they're trying to escape a famine. And we see in these multiple generations of the family all of these different reasons for immigration. And all the reasons for immigration today and for centuries have basically fallen into those same categories. And immigrants have a lot of variety, and it's important to know why they came, what they were hoping for, what they were fleeing from. But in the end, all immigrants share a lot of experiences too. The experience of being in a land where nobody speaks your language, where you're dependent on people and systems and social structures and governments that you don't understand because you never learned about in your schools growing up, where people may look at you funny and may walk the other way because you don't look like one of us. So Joseph and his brothers now end up sharing a lot of that experience of being not trusted, rejected, put on the margins of society because of their immigration status. And as the story goes, Joseph, the older brothers don't remember him. They tossed a kid into this well. And now here he is as maybe a 50-year-old grown man. And he is now speaking Egyptian because he learned a new language after 40 years of immigration. He is dressed like an Egyptian. He works with Egyptians. They don't see the 8-year-old child that they tossed in a well and probably assumed was long dead for one reason or another. So Joseph gives them some food and says, and gives them some instructions for what to do before they'll get more. And Joseph keeps bringing them back, and at one point, he just can't take it anymore. And Joseph breaks down in tears, and he dismisses all of his other colleagues from the room and is just left with his brothers. And he says, I am Joseph, the one you sent away. And I can only imagine what goes on in those brothers' minds. We are here begging for our life and for food to feed our aging father. We have no other choices. We are in the middle of the government palace in Egypt. They are entirely in control, and our future, our family's future, lies in the hands of a boy that we abused. And when Joseph stops crying, he tells his brothers, "You don't have anything to be afraid of. Yes, you left me for dead and sold me into slavery. But now I realize that God sent me here before you to save the lives of the people." And that reinforces one of the big ideas we get through Genesis, that God is often using immigration as a way to save people. In this case, it was to change the government from the inside in Egypt so that they would be prepared for a famine, so they would have enough food to feed themselves and everybody else. When Joseph says he's been sent by God to save people, he does not mean only his family. There would have been no way to save his family without a huge, decades-long government works project in Egypt. I mentioned last week, I don't know how to answer a hypothetical question like, does God know how to save only one group of people at a time? God knows a lot of things that I'm not privy to. God has strategies, I'm sure, that haven't been used yet in a universe this young. So I'm not going to get into that hypothetical with you. What I am going to say is that every time I see God saving one person, God ends up saving families and nations all at once. And that's kind of the connecting pin, and to understand the power of what Joseph has said, that God sent me ahead of you, that immigration is when God sends people to be the salvation for their people back home and for their new people altogether. We need to stop thinking of immigration as a social problem or something that just happens in parts of the country in the last couple decades. Immigration is one of God's biggest tools and strategies for saving large groups of people. Not that it can't be misused and fall short of the glory of God, but God intends it as a tool for salvation. And to see that, we've got to start into the sequel from Genesis, which is the book of Exodus. The last parts we read out of Genesis last week were about 3 chapters from the end. And as soon as Genesis ends, Exodus begins with some time lapse. I mean, that's the way most sequels start, right? And it says, there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. That could be a matter of months after Joseph died. That could be decades. That could be centuries. I don't have any idea. What we are told is that the descendants of Joseph's father, Israel, are still living in Egypt, but no longer are they seen as heroes that because of Joseph saved Egyptians from the famine. No, they're seen as culturally different. And there's a concern that they are growing too fast and that the immigrant population is increasing in number and strength and influence. And that's where the Egyptians really lose their cool. They were nice to immigrants when immigrants were a single family of near starving people. When the immigrants started to look like they might outnumber the original race populating that land, then they thought the immigrants needed to be controlled and suppressed. You see, that has been the story of immigration ever since. The established people in the land, the people of settled power, do not want to see the immigrants get numerous. And there begins discrimination and oppression. More of the Israelites were forced into slavery. And even after they were enslaved, their conditions kept worsening, until Pharaoh put out a law saying there are too many of these Israelites. So here's the new law. The army is empowered to go out and look for any Israelite boy under the age of 2. For every boy you find, kill the boy. And that will stop the Israelites' numerical growth. Now, for a variety of reasons, that didn't work in the long run. And Pharaoh's plan just created more oppression, more hostility, more distrust. Of course, letting someone's children die is never going to lead to conditions of trust and cooperation. But that's what happened. So the Israelites are enslaved at the end of chapter 1 in Exodus. And the end of chapter 2 tells us, and let me get my Bible out so I'm not quoting that all from memory. This is Exodus 2, verse 23, starting in the middle. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried to the heavens. Out of slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. And God heard their groaning. God remembered the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. The way I like to think of that is the first time an Israelite tear hit the ground, God heard it shake the heavens. And God responded with care and compassion. But immigration issues are tricky to solve. Slavery is a multi-generational problem that is hard to uproot from any society. The next thing that happens in the story is 40 years later. I want it to be a story where God comes swooping out of the skies on chariots or war eagles or something and has a mighty staff and strikes down the evil Egyptian slavers to set the Israelites free from slavery as oppressed immigrants. That's the way it happens in the movies I watch. But God is, I used to think God was patient. Now I kind of think that God is crafty. God could come down in power and might and solve things immediately. But God's goal that Joseph shared was to find salvation for all the peoples. And God chooses not just to save one group of people, but to transform the situation from a sick society to a healthy one. That's harder. That takes time. And God goes to Moses, a servant who was himself an immigrant, who is another part of the story. He grew up in Egypt and then was kicked out of the house and exiled from the country under a death sentence. So he is living in another foreign country where he didn't grow up, where he didn't speak the language. He has been running from the law and becomes an immigrant that way. And God starts working with Moses and says, I've got a plan. Bear with me. This may not make sense at first. But I want you to go back to Egypt and talk to the Pharaoh and say to the Pharaoh, you must release all of the Israelites. And Moses says, no. No way, no how. I have a death sentence in the whole country. Nobody's going to let me get close to Pharaoh. They will just kill me out and out. And besides, how in the world am I going to convince Pharaoh with all this power that Pharaoh should let some of his own slaves go free? Slavers do not give up their property quickly or easily. And God has a very intricate plan that takes quite a while to unfold, and Moses keeps going back and negotiating with Pharaoh, and it's quite an exciting story. And God keeps trying to get Pharaoh's attention and show Pharaoh that, the king thinks he's in control, thinks he rules the country. And God keeps reminding Pharaoh, you're not in charge of everything you think you are. So here's a hailstorm. Can you make that stop? No. Here's plagues and all these other things. And then, after about 10 chapters, where Pharaoh keeps saying no. Some days he'll say yes and then change his mind back to no the next day. So it kind of feels like Moses is making some progress in talking the government into some immigration reform that would end slavery. But Pharaoh keeps going back to the, no, I don't want to let my slaves go. So then there's one more step. It's the step that is celebrated in the Jewish holiday of Passover. And is happening around the 12th chapter of Exodus. And after spending all this time and having so little response from Pharaoh, it's time for more drastic measures. I'm not sure we'll ever be able to answer the question of just how far would God go to free slaves and rescue immigrants. But I'll tell you this, how far God would go to do that is beyond our understanding. God is so committed throughout Scripture to rescuing immigrants that God begins to think stuff that for us should just stay unthinkable. So God says to Moses, tell Pharaoh that every household in Egypt is at risk and will suffer grave losses if you do not release the slaves. Pharaoh's response is basically, who cares? God has shown might and power repeatedly. Pharaoh refuses to acknowledge it. And so then in chapter 12, God explains the next step of the plan to Moses. And it's a very intricate plan. God says, tell all of the Israelites this. Tomorrow is the day of rescue. So you need to get ready tonight. You're going to be going into freedom, and you need to leave ready for travel. You need to leave with a full stomach, because the path out of slavery, the path to freedom for everyone, is not a quick, easy path. So tomorrow morning, get up early, be ready to travel. And tomorrow morning, I'll do a horrible thing. The angel of death will come and go into every household and take the firstborn. You didn't think God would go that far? Pharaoh didn't think God would go that far. And what God is willing to do is frightening. And it should especially be frightening to any one of us who stands in the way of liberation and economic equality and full fair treatment of immigrants. Because that's what God has accused Pharaoh of doing. God is serious. And if any one of us thinks we have a right to stand in God's way or a chance of saying no to God repeatedly like Pharaoh, we are wrong. God demands justice for immigrants. So God says, now, this is going to be happening tomorrow morning all over Egypt. So for you Israelites, here's what you have to do to be safe. I want you to have a big lamb dinner tonight. Take some of the blood from the lamb, place it on the edges of your doors. And when the angel of death comes, the angel will spare everyone inside. The ways this is usually interpreted is that God is trying to save Israelites at the expense of Egyptians. But we really needed to have read Genesis first and see that God has sent Abraham to be a blessing to all the families of the earth, and that God has sent Joseph ahead to provide salvation for all peoples. If you're a stranger to God and God's tactics, you might believe God actually wants to kill Egyptian children. But if you've been reading carefully, and if you've begun to learn to trust in this God, you know that there's something else God has in mind. And so God gives Moses some further instructions. Every Israelite household needs to take a full-grown ram, and at sunset, begin to prepare it for a feast. Now, the Israelites would know this is really weird. It takes something like 12 hours to cook a decent-sized lamb. if we start cooking at midnight or at sunset, we're barely going to be ready to eat by morning. And God said, yeah, do that. Sure, it's weird. And God said, there's another rule. You're going to have to eat the entire lamb by daybreak. And so if you, in your household, cannot cook and completely devour a lamb just by yourselves in 12 hours, which nobody could do, then you have to invite in your neighbors and your neighbors' neighbors, and as far out as you need to get enough people to have the lamb ready to eat in the morning and to eat it all immediately. And sometimes because as a nation, we got extremely good at segregation. We ended up with thousands of laws in place, federal, state, local, everything, about segregation of races. Ancient Israel wasn't that good at it. They didn't spend 200 years perfecting those systems. So when we, children of segregation, interpret these texts, we kind of automatically think they're like us. And so the question is, who's the neighbor of an Israelite family? Are they living in a ghetto and living among Israelites in a segregated community? So there's this big barbecue going on in the Israelite quarter of the city, and none of the Egyptians know. That's not the way they live. In fact, we got a very direct statement of that in the chapter just before. And this leads up to it too. Chapter 11 starts, the Lord said to Moses, I'll bring one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt, and afterwards he will let you go from here. So tell the people, tell the Israelites, every man and woman need to go to their neighbor and to ask them to borrow objects of silver and gold. They're going to their Egyptian neighbors. Or maybe they're people who wouldn't call themselves Egyptian, except in the sense that they live in Egypt now. Maybe they were immigrants from other countries who were also enslaved. Maybe they did live in an enslavement camp. But their neighbors are not Israelites, or at least not only Israelites. It's everybody else. And I live a little bit in the mountains, and it may not be as civilized as Cathedral City. But if I went door to door in my neighborhood asking people to give me all their silver or gold, I bet one of them would pull out a gun on me. Maybe because I've not been a very good neighbor, maybe it's all my fault, but this is a big ask. You say yes to let someone borrow your silver and gold, only if you really trust them. So this is telling us one other fact. The Israelites not only lived among Egyptians, but had built long-term relationships of trust with them. So in chapter 12, when they're told, you've got to prepare a feast, cook a lamb by morning, and invite in however many people it's going to take to eat that lamb in one sitting. Everybody's inviting neighbors. I don't know how many people it takes to eat a lamb. But I frequently hear guesses from a couple dozen to a couple hundred, depending on its size and all that. you can't eat it as a single family. You have got to go to multiple neighbors around you and have them bring their whole families. And then, as soon as night falls, you've got 11 hours to cook a lamb, which is mostly just standing around and watching. It's faster than watching paint dry, but by the time you get to 2 in the morning, everybody's saying, so why did you call a nighttime party? Why didn't you just cook it in the day and invite us over for dinner? And if the Israelites are honest with their neighbors where they have good, trusting relationships, they would say, God told us. This is part of God's plan to save him. And I believe that those good-hearted, God-fearing Israelites would spill the plan to their neighbors. The neighbors are watching as the Israelites are packing up everything they own, including the neighbor's silver and gold. And they're saying, tomorrow morning, we're leaving here and never coming back. And one of those neighbors has got to ask, can I have my silver and gold back before you leave? If you let your neighbor borrow your tools or your kitchen utensils and you see the moving van come up, any of us would go do that. And when it's silver and gold, all the more so. So I think God has set all this up so that Israelites tell the scary news and the good news. The good news is that God is going to overthrow Pharaoh and destroy the economy built on slaves. And the good news is, if you come with us at daybreak, you will be free. Now, if they were born in Egypt, they're still Egyptian. But if they walk out of the country, they're free. And there's a term for people who walk across a river to get to the other side. In Hebrew, that word is ivri, which is the root of the word Hebrew. They are the people who have passed over. No matter what country you were born in, no matter what country you immigrated to and lived in, if you walk out of Egypt, away from the slavers, into freedom, following God, you are now Hebrew. You have passed over. And God has explained that tomorrow morning when the army gets up and discover that if they hadn't had Israelite friends to tell them, they're going to wake up to crisis and shouting. That will give you enough time to make a break for it and escape. I think when the Israelites left, they took with them all their friends. Because if you found out you could be free by just walking out of town, wouldn't you want to tell all your friends, all your neighbors, all the people who you were exchanging jewelry with, all the people who were playing with your kids in the streets? And so what happens is that it's Israelites and Egyptians, people of every nationality, people of every language who have been enslaved by Egypt, who get up in the morning and walk out and become free. God has rescued the Israelites in a way that rescues any slave who is willing to walk away. And God rescues people of every nationality and of immigrant and citizenship status together by using, again, the tool of immigration. All you have to do is leave the politics of Egypt. All you have to do is walk out and see what's on the other side. What's on the other side, life after slavery, it's not easy. It takes decades and generations to get over the way that immigrants and slaves' souls have been poisoned by abusive, oppressive governments. But freedom is possible if you immigrate away from the slavery. I would say this may point to one of the biggest mistakes of American thinking, that we could infect this land with slavery and then somehow pass a law that says it's over. That we could somehow bring in wave after wave of immigrants, some of them forced, some of them fleeing other things, some of them having hopes, just every kind of reason you can imagine for someone to immigrate to this country. And that we could treat them poorly. And that our society could stand strong when we don't treat the immigrants well. All of this is happening in chapter 12 of Exodus, leads up to a parting remark as God sends the people forth. It's down toward the bottom of chapter 12, talking about how you need to remember this day and celebrate it every year because it's a day of freedom. And so the Israelites left, got on their way after 430 years of slavery. And I think we have a racist translation in Exodus 12:43. It quotes God saying to Moses and his brother Aaron, this is the instructions for the Passover. And in my English NRSV, it says, no foreigner shall eat of it. I think it has that exactly backwards. No one who eats of it shall be a foreigner. Because if you accept God's salvation, you are all one family. You are the children of God. There are no more foreigners. No slave or free, no Jew or Greek, as Paul would say much later. But anyone who has been a former slave can eat of it. Because the Passover is a celebration not just of my group's freedom or my group's Independence Day or my country's or your nationality's. Passover is a celebration that freedom can come to everyone. And then, down by verse 49, God's last word in the Passover is there. It says, there shall be one law for the native and for the immigrant who resides among you. This is the first time God has tried to give people instruction on how to live. And the legal foundation for God's people of freed slaves called Israel, called the crossed over ones, those set free. The basic law is everybody has the same law. There are no foreigners, there are no immigrants, there are no citizens. You are all part of one family. You live and die together. And you cannot make any legal distinctions. I don't want to get entirely into contemporary politics, But can you imagine? There are a lot of people who want to put God's rules from Exodus in the courthouse. There are lots of people who want to claim this is the foundation for our U.S. law. And they also want to keep foreigners and immigrants out. When the basic principle of law is citizens and immigrants are treated exactly alike. There's no such thing as extra rights for citizens. There's no such thing as freedoms that are held back from immigrants who haven't proven their citizenship yet. There is only one law in God's word. And that law is to bring about equality of all peoples, immigrant or not. In some ways, you could say that the next 30-some chapters of Exodus, all of the law that God gave on Mount Sinai, even the 10 Commandments, are basically special cases and elaborations on this one law. Treat everyone equal. Do not treat anyone the way societies treat immigrants. Why? You know what it was like to be immigrants and foreigners and sojourners and slaves in Egypt. And if you know nothing else, you should know to never do that to a single living being again. This is a radical, world-changing law. And it comes about because God rescues immigrants. God uses immigration to rescue slaves and make them free. And God expects those of us who have been set free, those who have been saved, to grant the same rights, privileges, and salvation to everyone regardless of immigration status. That is a demanding law that, frankly, none of our world in the 3,000 years since has lived up to. But it's the beginning of how being Israelite is different. It's the beginning of how being Christian or being Bible devoted or being followers of God goes. It's the law before the 10 Commandments. That is how seriously God takes the liberation of peoples and the equality of peoples and the need to tear down laws and practices that separate races, separate languages, and separate so-called immigrants from others. And I say so-called. I am American by birth. I am Californian by birth, though I spent a good part of my adulthood somewhere else. I have all those claims to citizenship. But I must never use those to discriminate against someone else. My great-grandparents were immigrants from outside this country in. The Census Department didn't give them separate names, just a nickname by their nationality. They were not called slaves, but they were chained together at the ankles to work the fields by day with somebody to whip them if they didn't produce enough. Almost everyone I know in this country has an immigration story that may be very recent, in which their family members, their loved ones, maybe even you yourself, was oppressed and segregated and mistreated because of race or immigration. Even for those of us born here, that's what American laws did to our families too. Maybe a few enough generations back that you've tried to forget. But this is the story of every family. And we share this to never treat others like our families were treated. It is God's one law. And almost exactly at the end of time, but maybe a question or two.
Yeah, I think there might be some questions. If someone would like to ask a question, it's nice to come up here because then we can hear you. Does anybody have a question from there? Well, I'll just have a comment. Last week I kind of had my mind blown a little bit when I realized that you taught that Joseph fulfilled the promise God gave to Abraham. Through Abraham, all nations of the world would be blessed. I have always interpreted that something that happened a long time later, but you taught, it just happened, with Joseph in Egypt, and I thought, wow, I missed that. That was never taught to me. To see that fulfillment right then. And of course today, this idea that the one law about immigration, to not treat them, somehow that had not been taught either to me in all my Bible and seminary training. So
nobody wants to put that Bible quote on the courthouse door.
It never was highlighted for me. Yeah. I could have missed it easily. I missed other things in Bible college and seminary too, so shouldn't blame them, but I never caught on.
As a seminary professor, I'll say we very often leave out all the good stuff.
That's too bad. I love that. Okay, anybody else have any comments before we end? I just love it. You exceed my expectations every time because to have these nuggets of truth that are so different from how I've usually looked at these scriptures. So it's very wonderful. I can't wait to tell other people.
Well, and our churches kind of tend to think about immigration, even if we want to be compassionate and progressive. We tend to think of it through a lens of a passage like Matthew 25, where we're being asked to imagine that the prisoners and the homeless and the hungry we should treat as well as we would treat Jesus. And it's got a lot of sentimentality and encourages us to be charitable. Feed the hungry is charity. Dismantle the systems of racism is something other than charity.
Yeah.
It's making real change and changing the basis for our society and the way we live with each other. And God asks for no less. And by the time Jesus comes around, God's been making the same point for about 2,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
When God finally says, let me try this. I'm going to pack up and move among you. And I'll find out in my own body how you treat immigrants.
Yeah.
And then say, this is exactly, what's being done to Jesus is exactly how not to treat an immigrant.
So in saying that, are you saying that by the Son of God becoming flesh and dwelling among us, that was an immigration?
It's the Bible describes it with some of the same verbs.
Oh.
As if you move to Egypt, what they say is you've gone down to Egypt.
Right, go down.
Yeah, it's not downhill, it's down south, but still. Yeah. You have to go down and go through some rivers to get there, so it's down in that sense. And so when Scripture tells us that God went down to live among us, that's how one of the ways people talk about immigration. Yeah. And in fact, Gospel of John says that God picked up a tent and camped with us for a while. Mm-hmm. Why? Because when God shows up, we don't let him into anybody's house. So he's in a makeshift tent, living in the encampment on the fringes of town. Yeah. Okay. The same way we treat immigrants too often. So,
well, very profound.
Next week, we will get back to some Genesis, and we will explore some of these things in other places. But now we've heard the stories, now we've seen the law that is the result of why we were told those stories. So
wonderful. All right, well, thank you. And everyone, welcome. Same time, same place.
Okay. Thanks to all of you.
Bye. That's sort of everybody there. So I don't know if you can see. Yeah, question here.
Yes, for publication purposes, episode 3, what should we title it?
Oh, what should we title episode 3, do you think, John? Boy, you stumped the professor with that one, Kathleen.
Well, I've mentioned several of the reasons for immigration.
Yeah.
I want to go back to Genesis and deal with a passage where there's a very different reason for immigration that has become surprisingly relevant again.
Okay, a different
Maybe
reason.
Yeah. So
you're very good at not like you hold the surprise to the end. You're very good at not giving it away. So I like that. Okay, a new reason. Very good. We'll see you next week.
Okay.
And
thank you, everyone.
Everyone else is watching. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.